Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our SciComm Academy lunch talk. So while people are still logging in, I'll start with a quick intro to the SciComm Academy. So my name is Danielle, and I'm the project manager of the SciComm Academy at SciMingo. And SciMingo is a nonprofit based here in Brussels, and we're helping researchers take their first steps in science communication. So at SciMingo, we run several initiatives, and one of them is the Flemish PhD Cup, where young researchers explain their PhD in just 90 seconds to a broad audience. And that's a great challenge. Imagine years of research packed into 1 minute and a half. It's pretty challenging. But yeah, this year's final is next Tuesday, the 21st of October, and our 8 finalists will compete for the title, and you can already vote for your favorite for the Publieksprijs. So that's the audience awards at phdcup.be. And if you do that, you could win like a book package around 10 years of PhD Cup. So under SciMingo, we also host the SciComm Academy, which offers hands-on courses in science communication. We help researchers like you strengthen their communication skills and share their work with the world. And we offer courses such as presenting on stage, popular science writing, podcasting, and more. And everything's very hands-on, and you always work towards a concrete end product. Our autumn edition is fully booked, but the spring courses will be announced soon. So check out our website for this new spots coming up, or sign up for a newsletter. And in order to help you with that, you see 2 colored QR codes on my Zoom background. The purple one will lead you to our course page, and it's always a bit difficult with mirrored situation. And the orange one will lead you to the newsletter subscription page. So then let's go on to the topic of today. So today's lunch talk is all about science communication for policy making, and then specifically during a health crisis. So how can communication make or break evidence-based policy making? So when a crisis hits, how do science and policy really talk to each other? How do knowledge and data move between experts, policymakers, and the public? And what can we learn from the pandemic to do better next time? So we're very happy to have Ingrid Van Marion leading today's talk. And she will introduce both herself and the panelists for today. So Ingrid, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and for SciMingo to invite me to do the lunch talk today. So my name is Ingrid. I have a PhD in clinical neurosciences, but I had switched to do research on science communication. And I didn't want this to be just a hobby, so I searched for academic training and I found none in Belgium. So I did a master in science communication in the Netherlands at the TU Delft. And since then, I have been interested in how patients can be involved in scientific research and the role of communication in that. And then I had a very concrete first introduction with Science for Policy when I analyzed how the Dutch Blockchain Coalition created a strategy to implement what was then still a very new technology into Dutch society. And there were many different stakeholders around the table, including academic blockchain developers, public servants, notaries, representatives of banks, energy companies, and shipping logistics. And they all had very different, very specialized knowledge about blockchain, and they came from different organizational cultures. So it may not surprise you that there were actually many communication challenges for them, even if they were all speaking Dutch. So I'm also a founding board member of the nonprofit SciComm, a Belgian networking organization, as I think it is important to bring science communication research, practice, and training together. And since January 24, I have been involved as a researcher at ULB in BPIN. And I work together with my colleague David Domingo, who does research on journalism. And we lead a work package in the Belgian Pandemic Intelligence Network project, which is funded by BELSPO. And a lot of you may not actually want to hear about COVID anymore, but bear with us, because that's just the context, all right? We'll be focusing on the communication aspects of policymaking, and I will not be judging policy today, because that's just not my job. So before I get into the science of science communication, let me introduce you the panel members of today. It's Mieke van den Broeke, and she's a researcher at the Linguistics Department of the University of Antwerp, and she has studied the public communication during the pandemic. And with her team, she has also produced recommendations for the stakeholders involved in health crisis management. We also have Erika Vliegel, a medical doctor of infectiology at the University Hospital of Antwerpen, and she's a member of our work packages on communication at BPIN as well. And of course, she has coordinated several of the advisory boards during the pandemic, and as you may know, she was very often present in the news. Then there's Neil Hens, a biostatistician at the University of Hasselt, but he also works at the University of Antwerpen and is the coordinator of BPIN. He participated actively in the advisory boards and also interacted regularly with journalists. All right, so both Erika and Neil are still very active in scientific advisory roles, but today we're also joined by Jorgen Stassijns, who works at CIENSANO, which is the Federal Institute for Public Health Research, and he is the head of the Crisis Coordination Unit dealing with preparedness and response for pandemics and other health crises. Since October 22, he also coordinates the Risk Assessment Group, and is one of the main scientific advisory boards in this context, and he can give us his perspectives, or I hope he wants to do that at least, on the current developments of evidence-informed policymaking in Belgium. So Jorgen actually has a bit of a different profile, as he is the facilitator of this knowledge exchange between scientists and policymakers, and you could actually say he is a knowledge broker for those in the know. We did invite policymakers to talk with us today, but unfortunately they could not make it. So I will present their point of view through quotes from interviews that we have conducted with the collaboration of Shona Cosgrove and Miriam Sasso from CIENSANO. All right. So what is this Pandemic Intelligence Network about? Well, it's a lot of different people from different institutes and knowledge backgrounds working together to improve pandemic preparedness and response. And one way to do this is by sharing knowledge and data for policy advice. At the core of the project, you find 3 work packages that focus on surveillance data, epidemiological insights, and insights on how pandemics may have an impact on society. I don't have expertise on the science that happens in those work packages, and I've had to learn a lot of jargon and abbreviations very fast during our meetings. But my task, together with my colleagues in Work Package 4, is to improve communication practices related to this network. And we're very lucky to also have Erika Vliegel on the team, as she has so much experience with policy advice. And as I already mentioned, we also collaborate with the colleagues of Work Package 5 for the interviews, as they explore what the governance of this network could look like. So governance actually has a lot of connections with communication of scientific knowledge and data. And if you want to know more details about BPIN, you can also have a look at the website, pandemicintelligence.be. Now, from my own introduction, you may have already guessed that my motto is science communication is everywhere. Well, almost everywhere, because as an academic field, it's actually underdeveloped in Belgium. And did I already mention there is no master on science communication in Belgium? So I look at the work that my international colleagues in the field do, and Maya Horst describes science communication as organized, explicit, and intended actions that aim to communicate scientific knowledge, methodology, processes, or practices in settings where non-scientists are recognized part of the audiences. So remember these words: organized, explicit, and intended actions. All right, well, when we started to design this project of BPIN, I did not quite know what I was getting myself into when I decided to actually also include all stakeholders who have different knowledge backgrounds regarding science in a pandemic policy context. But those stakeholders are those who have an interest in the pandemic policy or are affected by it. And the context that BPIN aims to promote is evidence-informed policymaking, EIPM, which scientific knowledge and data is a crucial part of that evidence. All right, so EIPM is the result of systematic and transparent processes to access, assess, adapt, and apply scientific evidence in decision-making processes. But that's a very idealistic view, because pragmatic EIPM is actually about recognizing the limitations of that evidence and our ability to act on it. So science does not equal policy, and there is a lot more involved in political decision-making. Research on EIPM shows that communication is an essential factor for successful transfer of scientific processes, for scientific knowledge, but it never really goes deep into the analysis of the communication processes that make it happen. So this is why a lot of the people involved in Belgian pandemic preparedness and response look at the evaluation reports of the OECD, and that is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And they have analyzed the strengths and weaknesses of this EIPM system, and they also identified challenges, and a lot of them have to do with communication. And I've marked them in green here in this graphic. So they find lack of coordination and collaboration. They find difficulties at the political and stakeholder level. They found challenges in data accessibility and also issues with the science policy interface. And you could say that interface is actually another fancy word for communication. So they actually specifically mentioned that the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted gaps in coordination and communication. But unfortunately, they did not have a plan full of organized, explicit, and intended actions. So to solve this communication problem, so we made a plan to have a closer look at what should and could be improved. And to do that, of course, I turned to my own discipline for answers. And from a science communication perspective, there are two important moments that we study in BPIN. And on the one hand, on the left, there is the organizational communication, which is the communication of knowledge and data, mainly between scientists and policymakers. And on the other end is the public communication, or communication of evidence as part of policy justification and the science of a pandemic. Now, what does that look like? Science communication is everywhere, I'm afraid. This overview is still very oversimplified, but it gives an idea of what we find when we develop the scientific literature into a theoretical framework to represent all those involved in pandemic management. And there are two main areas that are intertwined with each other. There's the policy arena in blue, which is an area of restricted access where decisions are being made based on advice that directly reaches the policymakers through these advisory mechanisms, but also informal contacts. And then there is the public sphere in yellow, where those decisions are explained, discussed, and contested through the news media and social media. So as you can see, there is a wide variety of knowledge profiles that influence policymaking and communication. The blue lines represent what I call organizational communication, often policy advice, and the reddish lines represent public communication about the science-based policy and the science about the pandemic. I figured out that we were going to have to talk a lot about a lot of people, and we still have quite some interviews left to do as well. But hey, that's the challenge I took on. There is no manual for making this pandemic communication and management of the pandemic happening in Belgium. So I will give you a moment to make sense of it, because it's quite a lot.
And then while you take this moment, maybe for the people that are watching and listening today, if you have any questions about what Ingrid is telling you or about what any of the other panelists share or say, you can always drop your question in the chat, and then after the talk, there's a moment for a Q&A. So I will collect your questions and yeah, they will be answered.
We'll try. So because of the time constraints of Mieke, I wanted to start with the public communication, and actually that will also be the part that's most familiar to most of you, I think. Later we will look behind the scenes of the policy arena as we dive into the communication processes that make decisions and measures happen. So public communication, you may remember, and these posters may be familiar to some of you, and some may even have engaged with this online campaign to make your own message. This campaign by the federal government happened during the summer of 2020, and they tried to connect to the motivations of each of the 11 million Belgians to follow the rules. But how likely was it that they reached all of them, all 11 million of them? Well, you can already see in this image that language matters, and we will talk about that later as well. So I would like to discuss this with Mieke, who has done research about public communication during the pandemic and how to reach publics in vulnerable circumstances. And Mieke co-authored this article and a report on these topics. So let's start with the scientific article, which is open source and available to all, and I really recommend to read this. And I wonder, Mieke, could you tell us a bit more about the barriers for public communication about measures during the pandemic that you found in your study?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me, everyone? Yes. So Like you said before, what or at least what the consortium that I led during 2020 and 2021, what we worked on is a very large project that was funded by the Ministry of Health and Cienzano, and we wanted to examine how we can make public communication more inclusive, more accessible to reach, as you said, all members in Belgian society. And so we developed evidence-based recommendations on how to make COVID-19 communication more inclusive. And some of the barriers that we observed pertained on the one hand to language use, as you said. So linguistic barriers, think about someone's literacy or someone's proficiency. For example, someone who is not proficient enough in Dutch or in French, or someone who may not actually be able to read the text that is shown on one of the posters that you've shown on the slide, but also what we called textual barriers, so barriers that may prevent someone to access or to understand the actual message of the public communication because it's overly complex or because it's unclear. Now, a very well-known example that I think most people in this virtual room will remember is the PowerPoint that was used during the press conference to explain the bubbles. It was very complex, it was not clear, and many people did not really understand it. A third type of barrier pertains to cultural factors. So think, for example, of the use of colors, whose meaning might differ depending on what your cultural background is. But also think, for example, if you have a certain infographic that you've designed in which you want to explain a particular order of events, say how to obtain a vaccine, etc. This needs to be designed differently depending on the language and sort of the reading and writing order of your audience as well. And then finally, a final type of barriers that we observed that we wanted to tackle are sensorial barriers, so barriers that relate to someone's permanent or temporary visual or auditory impairments. Think of blindness, hearing loss, deafness. So, for example, how can the use of a sign language interpreter, which at one point was indeed introduced, how can we use those to make public press conferences accessible to people who are deaf? So those types of barriers do exist in public communication at times.
I think that connects very much to also the science communication practices that we see very often as well. So definitely some points to keep in mind. If we then go on, you also were part of this report from 2022 towards an inclusive COVID-19 crisis communication policy in Belgium. Who did you write this for?
Oh, that is a very good question. We wrote this for stakeholders of any kind. So I think in the initial start of the project, it was the National Crisis Center who was carrying out all of the federal communication that was in need of advice. But I think it contains recommendations for stakeholders of pandemic management, of crisis management, of various stripes, because there's many recommendations that go beyond COVID, that go beyond COVID-19. So it is, I think, relevant for communication professionals, scientists, but also press officers, because of course, anyone who has a message that they want to communicate would, I believe, try to be as accessible as possible and as inclusive as possible to people of all abilities. So yeah, that was the intended audience of that very, very long project report.
Yeah, luckily there was also an executive summary that
luckily,
made it a little bit easier. But it's publicly available, so I think it would be good to have a look at that as well. If you're a communication professional, there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And therefore, I would like to ask you, what do you recommend to the stakeholders of pandemic management in relation to their public communication about measures?
For me, that is a bit of a difficult question because, as you said, the project was very large. It was a very large consortium. All of the recommendations in the project report were also very long, very extensive, some very practical of nature, some more process related. Yeah, but I think if I would have to be brief and sort of pick one, I think the most important recommendation that we should not overlook and that any stakeholder of pandemic management should bear in mind is the importance of face-to-face communication and one-on-one conversations, right? So an individual at risk or someone who, for whatever reason, may be more difficult to reach, is usually reached by an intermediary who has a one-on-one conversation with them and who translates official regulations to them, to their life world, and in words, in phrases, in a language that they understand. We know that not everyone actively searches for information themselves in government outlets. People also, unfortunately, do not always trust information that they receive in a sort of passive form, and at times they may experience certain difficulties in understanding pandemic information in its appropriate context and to translate that to your own world, to your own circumstances. And that is, I think, where the intermediary comes in. I think of a doctor or a pharmacist, a social worker, a teacher who already enjoys this relationship of trust with that individual. So for me, I think that's one of the most important recommendations I would have.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think you'll later on find that we will also talk about this, how important these informal relations are, but also these relations of trust. Yeah, sure. How would you say is this advice relevant for the SciComm activities of the viewers that are watching this lunch talk today and that are not involved in crisis management, but are involved in other activities of science communication?
That is, again, a very good question. I think I already answered it sort of in part when I said that anyone who wants to communicate about something scientific would fare well with actively thinking of how to be accessible, how to be inclusive in their communication strategy. Yeah, really thinking of who do I want to reach? How can I diversify the form of the message, the different channels as well? Because not everyone, especially because of the digital divide in society, not everyone is able to access an online meeting such as this one, for example. So I think science communicators would fare well to try and incorporate certain recommendations of inclusivity and accessibility in how they communicate. And this is perhaps maybe a bit more whimsical or philosophical, but also paying attention to inclusive and accessible communication is not only, in my opinion, a priority during a crisis outbreak, but it also contributes to the construction of an overall more inclusive society and social environment. And that, I think, is very important.
Thank you. So we already talked a bit about the digital divide, but a lot of communication also happened through social media. And our interviewees identified social media as one of the spaces where they felt there should have been a lot more intense presence of official communication about the pandemic. And a quote of the interviews would be, "I think we missed the chance of communicating through social media, making use of influencers," as you already mentioned as well. "I missed a social media strategy or sufficient rapid response, and there was no clear strategy at administrative level on how to handle social media as one of the major channels of communication," according to a ministerial cabinet advisor. So, Mieke, in the report, you explore different possible channels, and how can the governmental communicators also diversify their channels, and why would that be necessary?
I think the quote to me is very interesting, but I think only focusing on social media and making use of influencers, for example, would be a bit of an oversight, because one thing, and I mentioned it before as well, one thing that the COVID-19 pandemic made very, very clear is that we're dealing with a very wide digital divide in Belgian society. As I said before, not everyone has access to or has the necessary skills to use social media in a way that they would be able to find information. So if government communication wants to reach as many people as possible, then it is important that they diversify the forms of their communication materials so that these can be spread via a wide range of different communication channels. So not just focusing on social media, but also thinking of non-digital communication. And this can be traditional media, newspapers, TV, radio. But one of the things that in our results also came forward as being very important is the public space around us. Think about a poster that you see on the street or in a bus stop or in a waiting room at the doctor's office, which may then be read by many people. And here again, it's also important that you produce translations of that information and to provide that information multilingually, but indeed diversifying the information that you produce and sort of spreading that through different channels, that is the best way to reach as many people as possible, in my opinion.
Okay, I think that's very sound advice. All right, so all that we have discussed so far was happening in the public sphere, in the yellow zone. Let's get back to the process of evidence-informed policymaking inside the policy arena in blue in the graphic. So through a compilation of literature reviews on evidence-informed policymaking research, we actually collected 54 barriers and facilitators of knowledge transfer. And we organized them in 3 levels based on the work of Pareto, as you can see referenced here, and his colleagues. And on macro level, in green, we find factors related to political and national context. And on meso level, in light blue, we put factors such as leadership, culture, and available resources within an organization. And that icon represents an organization, but I'm a little bit biased here and someone else may actually see a virus in it. So we have to be careful when we use these icons and think about what other people could see in it. On the micro level, in dark blue, however, we identified factors that relate to the individual behavior, values, knowledge, and experience of the individual communicator. So there are contextual factors on one side and specific factors to communication practices that foster or complicate the conditions for good communication. And in the slide, you can see how many factors we put in each of these categories. But through interviews and media analysis and advisory reports, we are still identifying new factors. So this is very much an ongoing process. Now, before we jump into the macro level, we need to remember that in the scientific literature, these factors are actually not specific to pandemic crisis management, but more general for EIPM in health policy. So the literature does not describe all the stakeholders involved, and that is why we are still doing many of these interviews, and we have analyzed many policy documents to identify additional stakeholders and factors. So let's discuss the first factor I want to share with you today, which is organizational stability. And that brings me to the next slide. Organizational stability influences how science flows through the policy system. And in Belgium, this is really complex because of the federal structure. If you're not from Belgium and you're listening or watching this lunch talk today, then you will have to know that there are 6 ministers of health at different levels. And our study focuses mostly at the federal level. And to be honest, that's complicated enough. In the OECD evaluation, the process of pandemic management during the COVID-19 crisis has been represented as a complex layering of scientific advisory boards and policy bodies, with the scientific advice traveling upwards in this overview. So you start at the bottom and you slowly, well, not so slowly, sometimes travel up, where sometimes even phases are skipped. At the beginning of the pandemic, the top political responsibilities were Premier Sophie Wilmès of the famous PowerPoint that was already mentioned, and the Federal Minister for Health, Marie de Blok. In October 2020, there was a new government formed, and their successor, Premier Alexander De Croo and Health Minister Frank van den Broeke, had a very different management and communication style. So during the crisis, the government created new advisory boards and decision bodies, which were reshaped or scrapped with the transition of power. Voila. For scientific advice, this actually meant that Celeval became inactive and GEES, the group of experts for the exit strategy, was recovered and expanded after a period of informal advice and becoming the GEMS, the group of experts for the management strategy. And Erika knows these very well, as she was chair of them. These advisory bodies were created in parallel to the officially existing ones, RAG, which is now led by Jorgen, and the RMG. And at the political level, a Corona Commissariat was created to foster the coordination between scientific advice, and a consultation committee was formed to include the prime ministers of the regions in decision-making, because until then, they didn't seem to be consultants. So this image is really not complete, and there were also many, many task forces that were topic specific and that included scientific advice and professional expertise. And this picture has evolved since then, because now there's even new advisory bodies like the Strategic Scientific Committee or the RAG for Veterinary Emerging Zoonoses. So these contextual factors we may have very little power over this, and I think it's better to move on to the communication-specific factors at macro level. One of those communication-specific factors, we already mentioned it, we have to add it, it's language. And it's actually not unique to the Belgian context. It's not identified, however, in the literature of evidence-informed policymaking as a factor, but Belgian interviewees have told us how complicated it has been to have meetings in Dutch, French, and English. And German is also usually neglected. So for those of you watching from far, I can only insist Belgium is complicated, all right? Our project language is English, and that already makes connecting with some of our stakeholders a challenge too. And so one of the quotes from our interviews is that these language aspects, they play a role, and I cannot evaluate, for example, in terms of networks. I think that the Dutch-speaking experts have better access to the minister, and that was said by a Dutch-speaking policymaker. So I would like to ask to Jorgen, what is the work language in CNSANO, which is a Belgian federal institute, and what is the language used in the RAG discussions and reports? Does language influence the process of policy advice?
Yes, thanks, Ingrid. Well, it's a good question. We mix all kinds of languages. So CNSANO, as you say, is a National Public Health Institute. So internal meetings are in Dutch, French, or even English sometimes, or a mix of both languages. And it is indeed sometimes a challenge in terms of communication and getting your message across. At the level of the risk assessment group, most of our meetings are in English. Most of our documents are in English as well, although during COVID, our AP reports were in Dutch and French. But now, most of the work we produce is in English. But it is definitely a challenge to find the right language, and because not all people are sufficiently proficient in French or Dutch or in English, and it is always a challenge indeed to have to have everyone to be able to express his opinion as well in his own language or the other language. So yes, a challenge.
I feel that challenge because I have a Dutch background. I speak Dutch. My French is not very good, and I work at a French-speaking university, the ULB. So I'm very lucky that in this project I'm also joined by my colleague David Domingo, who has a Spanish background but then speaks French. So we hope that together we cover enough languages to be able to do these projects. Erika, can I ask you, how did you deal with language in the case of GEES and GEMS, or the GES and the GEMS? What was the language of the internal discussions and of the reports?
Well, for the sake of time at that moment, we were nearly always, certainly in the first waves, in the first year, nearly always working under time pressure. And so the already from the starting of the GEES, from early April 2020, we decided, okay, let's not complicate things too much. We all speak English. Let's go over to English. It's true with some exceptions. Some people said, well, it's much more comfortable for me if I can express this or this complex problem in my own language, in French or in Dutch. But The meetings were all in English and the reports were also in English. That was a bit a revolution, if I may say, because the normal way of working certainly in administration, public health administration, is chacun parle sa propre langue. Everyone speaks in his own language. And so the fact that we had reports in English was a bit, a revolution in the landscape of traditional advisory bodies, of which I had been part in the past, and where classically you always have Dutch and French translated, but yeah, we felt we did not have time for that. So that was the Habits in the G's, which was a relatively small group of 10, 11 persons. But then for the GEMS, we kept that because we felt it's the only way how we can work in a speedy way, and where, regardless of your language, nobody spoke perfect English, and so regardless of your language, you can add things. But for a minority of the members, it was a little bit blocking, I must say, but it was really for the minority.
Okay. And then it's good to have a team around that, and that has the patience and the willingness also to explain to each other, and yeah, feel free to speak up when they don't quite understand. Yeah. Okay, let's look at another macro factor that has a big impact on the communication challenges in policymaking: multidisciplinarity. If we look at multidisciplinarity, we actually did a media analysis showing that more than 120 different disciplines were mentioned in the news, in the print media, about COVID for about 2 years. But not all of them made it to advisory boards, and our interviewees, both policymakers as well as scientists, felt that social scientists were sometimes not sufficiently present. And we know that some scientists use the media to obtain attention from policymakers, and sometimes that was successful. A social psychologist ended up with being invited to take part in advisory boards. So if you choose your channels well as a scientist, you can reach the policymakers and eventually be invited to an advisory board. I also found some quotes in the scientific literature on this, where it says, complex, wicked problems like a pandemic affects all aspects of our lives. And there is the need for multiple scientific perspectives and other expertises. So it also includes professional and experiential expertise. Science communication is then a challenge, and it needs translation between this diversity of knowledge backgrounds. But we need to find a balance between too much and too little diversity of expertise, and between the different forms of expertise as well. And the scientific literature in evidence-informed policymaking then recommends inclusive advisory boards that provide a wider view of relevant expertise to rebuild trust and legitimacy of the policymaking process. And so therefore, I would like to ask to Neil, how did you share your knowledge with policymakers before you were on a scientific advisory board? And how did you actually become part of the scientific advisory board?
Thank you, Ingrid. Yeah, the sharing of knowledge before was pretty ad hoc and informal, by sending messages, basically, WhatsApp messages as well, and so on. Because I had no official role at that time. And basically, there was a colleague on television, Herman Gosses, who put forward that my group could actually predict when the peak would occur from the first wave. And that's how basically I ended up in the Zevende Dag again. And then a little bit later on, I was actually asked to take part in the Gs. And that's how it all started. So very much in a very ad hoc way, I would say.
So it's very good to have a good network and to have the phone numbers of a lot of friends.
Yes, that's always important, I think. Certainly in the midst of a pandemic, having a good network from different angles actually is extremely important. Okay.
And Erika, you led the GES, which consisted of 5 academics and 5 non-academics, and the GEMS as well, which was a much larger advisory board. And again, with both academics and non-academics. So I wondered, how did you manage that from a science communication perspective? Was it easy for you to share and for them to understand the science that was shared?
Okay, so that's for the work in the Gs, right? So the combination of scientific and non-scientific. that was complex, was a challenge, was also interesting, of course. The profiles were chosen by the Prime Minister. Yes, it was sometimes really two different worlds that had to come together. When on the one hand, for instance, Neil would explain how they built or they tried to build scenarios, already thinking with one part of the brain on the second wave and thinking in different scenarios, whereas then on the other hand, a captain of industry or governor of the National Bank, they come with a completely different setup. They think in an economical way, in business continuity manner. They think about all kinds of other logistic and organizational issues. On the other hand, but of course, they are also used to think in terms of figures. So at the end of the day, I mean, we managed to have information from one and going to the other. They would talk also very much in jargon and in business jargon, and so we had to explain quite a lot to one another. One of the other non-biomedical persons was an expert in law, so very different profiles, and we needed some time to explain our backgrounds and our way of talking and thinking to one another. So yeah, that was a challenge, and that has remained a challenge throughout. There has been a lot of goodwill and drive, and also time pressure and political pressure to land with recommendations, but it was absolutely difficult because yeah, in a normal circumstance, you would really come together gradually and know very well each other's backgrounds, and now there was not much time to do that.
Okay, thank you. I think in that it shows that it's very important to know what each other's background is and what actually also your own jargon and abbreviations are that we just so easily use but sometimes forget about. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to another factor, this time at the meso level, material and human resources. And there, the literature review showed that the lack of material and human resources, especially internet access, printed materials, and specialists to carry out searches for evidence really makes a difference. And this quote may sound anecdotal, but at the start of the pandemic, some of the policymakers were actually not able to meet online as they had no access to video conferencing, such as Zoom. That seems very weird these days. But that's what happened. They had no access until technicians had set it up in each individual work computer, and that kind of made meetings for them a bit more easier from then on. So this points to a contextual barrier that pops up in any study on evidence-informed policymaking. And to do it well, you need these resources to make it happen. And we know that a lot of people during the crisis put on hold their usual job to support policymaking. So for instance, the support team of the RMG, the Risk Management Group, consisted of FPS Health public servants that all of a sudden volunteered to do a different job. So you know that sadly, science communication is often seen as a hobby. And similarly, sharing academic expertise for policymaking is also voluntary and often not financially rewarded or institutionally compensated with time. And that is a very common issue. And during the pandemic, the dedication was especially intense with long added hours and uncertainty even of how long that crisis would last. So I wonder, Jorgen, would you be able to explain to us briefly how the RAG works on that, producing its risk assessment reports, and which material and human resources do you have, and how are the external experts acknowledged?
Yes, so the risk assessment group is an official scientific independent group of experts coordinated by Cienzano, but it is not the same as Cienzano. We do the coordination, so we have kind of a broad panel of experts in different topics related to airborne transmission, vector-borne transmission, etc. And these experts are asked for input in case we need to do a risk assessment. And of course, during COVID, it was very much asked for. Now we are working on different topics. Some specialists, some experts are consulted quite often. Other ones much less, because there is no need to do a risk assessment. And I think indeed during COVID, it was very, very intense with sometimes very short notice, need for advice, urgent advice, etc. And then indeed, yeah, you hope that experts will be able to provide advice on such a short notice and, as you say, on a voluntary basis. And I think it is a challenge to keep that network of voluntary experts active. And I think one of the points is that what I heard is in terms of recognition of experts. I don't think it's about financial recognition. I think everybody's there for the public health cause, and we all want to contribute to control of outbreaks, etc. But maybe more difficult is the lack of recognition in terms of advices are not, maybe not even followed, but nothing happens. You write an advice, you present it to policymakers, and then nothing happens. I think people, experts, can probably live with the idea that policymakers do not agree with some of their advice, because our role is not to do policy making. We just provide expert advice, and policymakers, they can say yes or no. We agree, we implement or not. But I think it happened during COVID, maybe less, but after that, as a risk assessment group, we carried out risk assessments and nothing happened anymore. And I think that is very frustrating for experts who dedicate quite some of their time sometimes to do this, and then you don't even know what happens. And I think that's something to keep in mind when we want to continue to keep this voluntary expert network for all different fields, that we recognize the work that these people are doing. And it can be putting their name on a website, making sure that their name is on the advice, that the names of people who contributed, or also maybe that there is, after an advice has been produced, discussed by policymakers, that there's also feedback to the experts. Say, look, this is what was discussed, this was accepted, this was not. And that's maybe also something that we need to improve a bit, is giving feedback to the experts after they have contributed to the advice.
I think that's indeed what I recognized from the interviews as well. When I saw some nods there from Erika and Neil, who probably have their own opinions about this as well. But for time purposes, let's move on. Another meso communication factor I would like to focus on is planning, strategic plans for knowledge exchange. I need to get some typos out there, I see. Decisions were made despite a lack of clear plan to share knowledge and information, and that was because people involved knew each other, as Neil already pointed out, before the crisis, or informally they found out who to reach out to. And we have some quotes from the interviews on that. We didn't have a nice flowchart in the beginning, said a regional public health agency worker, and the links with other entities were not very clear at the beginning. And the way a decision was communicated to the, somewhere, up there, somewhere, said federal public health agency worker. So I wonder, Neil, in your experience, how important were these informal contacts outside of the advisory board meetings to make things happen?
I think these were extremely important, and there are many examples to be given during the pandemic where these were really crucial in the way we went about it. So in a way, of course, you can have a structure, and if that structure works well, maybe it works, but sometimes these structures are also very slow. And having a direct contact, even with a text message saying, okay, this is important, we need to act and so on. Sometimes you need to go very fast in a crisis like that. So these ad hoc ways, I think they're inevitable in a way. But of course, it would be good that there is a structure in place on top of which they actually happen, and actually that you can also inform the people present in these structures that take these responsible positions and so on. So to get them on board because otherwise you get the feeling that there are two kind of communication pathways, and that's not the idea. I think that
sorry. I guess it's very important that also when there is not a crisis, but times of peace, as we say in the pandemic management, that we also work on our networks, and that if you want to get involved in policy advice, that you work on those networks and that you work on knowing who is involved and who is relevant to reach out to, both in your field of your disciplines, but also in the policy making world as well. So that comes down to very basic communication principles. Who needs to communicate what, to whom, and at what time? And that needs to be clear before the crisis to be able to manage a crisis. And in the Netherlands, there was a very clear weekly cycle for policymaking, and this may not be perfect when the urgency is larger, but it does give some structure. And in Belgium, things became more structured over time, but more recently, there has been a real effort to streamline the process, and a generic preparedness plan has been made. And this is what it looks like. This is the overview of the organogram of the GPP. And again, a language problem. It is only available in Dutch and French, so I'm sorry for those who do not speak Dutch. And this is not an operational communication protocol, though, as you can see. And the official documents do not help us much, actually, to make sense of the communication practices. The lines are there, but the operational details are not described. So from conversations with different stakeholders, we now know that they're working on it, and coordinated by a team within the FPS Half, there is a really big challenge to find out who is responsible of communicating what, when, why, and how. So policymakers, public servants, and scientists that we have spoken to acknowledge that this is still a problem. Communication strategies are actually usually not informed by scientific research, but very, very much often based on professional expertise and intuition. So a lot of meso problems are actually being solved at the micro level by simply just swapping phone numbers. All right, so if we then move on to the micro level, we actually have a mutual understanding as a factor, and it already came up earlier. It's this two mirrored crucial factors, the understanding of the scientific process by policymakers and the understanding of the policy process by the scientists. And empirical research on evidence-informed policymaking shows how science and policy have very different rhythms and priorities. They are two worlds, as Erika already said, with their own rules that are hard to understand. So here we have a quote from the literature. There is a lack of understanding between them about each other's working environments and responsibilities. Cooperation between the two parties is difficult to achieve, even in a favorable environment. But yeah, pandemic management, crisis time is something else. So I wondered, Erika, what is your experience with the communication challenges between the scientists and the policymakers? And do they really live in these different worlds? Does that then influence the policymaking process?
Yes, thank you. That's an interesting and complex question. I'll try to be brief for the sake of time. Yeah, indeed, scientists and scientific advisors on the one hand, and politicians, which is not the same as the total group of policymakers, of course, but politicians, we live in very different worlds with different mores, different habits, and different methodologies of reaching an agreement. And in scientific advisory group, we try to put on the table as much data and evidence as possible, and then we try to build the most rational and meaningful and evidence-based recommendations. That's and of course in COVID that was not an easy task because we often lacked evidence for very specific recommendations. But so there's also a part of pragmatism in there. But then on the other hand, politicians they work in a very different context. They work with the party and with their voting public on their shoulders, whispering things in their ears. They have and depending on, let's say, the framework in which they are working and living, that will influence very much the level of acceptance of scientific evidence. Some ministers are more keen and find that more evident than others. So politicians And so politicians live in a very different world, and so that's on decision making. But then on communication, so we as scientific experts, we all started as science communicators on the crisis, on the pathogen, on the problem, on the epidemic. But of course, as we all moved not only from being a scientist but scientific advisor, then of course we were also questioned by the advice we gave. And then normally you should have had a politician next to us to say, okay, that is what we did with the advice because this was workable, this was not workable, etc. That's their right as a politician, but they remained absent in the first phase of the pandemic. So that meant that we filled also in the beginning that space, thinking we needed to explain everything, which is not correct. So I think we learned also a bit the hard way that our role is to give scientific communication and also explain why we came to a certain advice and not to fill in the other box.
Okay, so I think that's a very good advice for those scientists who want to become policy advisors to think about what your role is and really, okay, are you there to give advice or are you there to explain policy? Yeah, it's something to keep in mind. All right, another micro communication factor that is very close to what we were just discussing is the connection of research to policy. And we have some quotes from the about scientific advice that was not always adapted to the information needs of policymakers. And one of the policymakers said, it evolved over time and the scientific people became smarter and the politicians became better in asking questions. And another policymaker told us the ministry would order a scientific report and formulate very clearly the questions we wanted answered. And there was also a lot of interaction and there was definitely a willingness to look into additional things. And the question we had asked 3 days ago would be nuanced a few times in 3 days or adjusted due to the changing context. All right, so recently the Superior Health Council has published an advice on flu vaccines that did not match the policy decision cycle. And the decision about the vaccine to buy was at the beginning of the year, but the advice came in the summer. And the timing of the advice did not match. So most people will get the same vaccine as last year instead of the newer and most effective one. And a little flashback to public communication here, the headline of the VRT then read, not enough high-dose flu vaccines available for all 65+ people, despite the advice of the Superior Health Council. And I now wonder how many people will interpret this as there are not enough vaccines available at all because they don't understand the nuance of high dose. And also, could the timing of this advice have been improved? Well, I guess we could talk about that for another hour, but I'll leave that for another day. The scientific literature shows that it's about finding the right timing and the right format of communication. And it's also about explaining your research, taking into account how policymakers think about the problem that you want to help them solve. But it's also about ethics. So if we take all of this together, well, that's actually why I find it important to think of science communication as a strategic activity. An activity in which we set objectives and we evaluate them, gathering evidence with scientific methods such as surveys and interviews. And I really recommend you to read this book to make sense of this perspective of science communication, regardless of who your publics are. So whether you want to connect to policymakers, citizens, or even specific groups with different knowledge backgrounds of science. One of the most important lessons in science communication is to actually get to know your public. And I realize how really strange that is when I don't know much about who is watching this today. So with this, I invite you to introduce yourselves and ask us some questions. Danielle, are there any questions that have come up?
The first question is from Nadia. And she writes, dear organizers, thank you very much for this very important webinar and opportunity to meet online again the experts from summer school modeling infectious diseases and pandemic preparedness. My question or possible case is that a few days ago, the information in social media in Ukraine was about several cases of hemorrhagic fever among Ukrainian soldiers in the Sumy region. Theoretically, it is possible because some volunteers from different countries, including African and Asian countries, take part in the Ukrainian army. From official side, it was not official information or explanation, maybe due to reasons of war actions in this region. What is the right approach in this situation? The local population is afraid because the need of knowledge and experience of diagnostics and treatment of hemorrhagic fever in Ukraine are not enough. In social media, the information about several lethal cases were, and then the question stops there. Anyone?
I think Erika would be the right one.
Yes.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm the right one, but it depends a bit on the context of the question, because this question involves much more than only communication. I think the logic step, outbreak-wise, would be that, for instance, there would be a field team doing an investigation, if possible, so in order to obtain as much as possible objective and trustable information, and that then based on these findings, official messages are being sent, like, yes, there is a problem and we are looking further into it, and these are first recommendations, or in the contrary, a reassuring, no, this is misinformation, this is not correct, and there is no so I think this is important. But first, you need a team on the ground who can collect as much as possible information.
Okay, thank
Maybe
you.
Jurgen wants to add something there.
Well, no, I think it's not communicating anything is probably definitely not an option. I think once it's in the news, I think you, as a government or whatever, you need to communicate something, and it can be uncertainty as well. So, but at least we are looking into it. We're doing our best to try to understand the situation. This is what we propose, and I think that should be done quite quickly, because once you have it spread in the news, then it's out of control. So I think as an authority, try to be proactive in this kind of situations.
I think in that it's good to have a strategy. Yeah.
Then the second question is from Seppe. And Seppe says, without going too much into detail about my ongoing analysis of tweets by WHO officials and advisors on the WHO's position regarding airborne transmission, one observation I've made is that officials sometimes discredit others' insights based on their scientific background or differing conceptions on what counts as strong evidence. I wonder, when there was a disagreement, for instance, about the evidence behind a recommendation or measure, how was this handled within these advisory committees in Belgium?
I'm happy to start. I think, let's say there was, of course, that we had to answer several questions with limited evidence, and so the way how to handle the limited evidence, and what sense to make from limited evidence, with all the caveats and the warnings. Yes, we had, of course, several topics on which there were differing opinions on, for instance, the strictness of certain measures. Think of the schools, for instance, of masks. So within advisory body groups, what we did then was really keep talking, try to bring on the table as much as possible findings, data, keep on discussing through and through, and maybe see if we could find any additional evidence, and or find ourselves a methodology, and we have developed, I mean, as a group several times, methodology such as the clique methodology, which was developed in the times of the G's, but also the virological footstep to give a size order to the impact, the epidemiological impact of certain interventions. So there's all ways of trying to objectivate as much as possible. And so we were seeking consensus as much as possible. I think it happened only once or twice that we could really not find final consensus, but we felt that these were weak advices, because if as an advisory body you don't agree in such a crisis situation, we felt that was not good.
Thank you. Neil, do you have anything to add there?
Thanks. I just want to add that I think we all have a kind of a bias in the way, of course, we come from a different domains, but also we're experts in different viruses and so on. So we have to be a bit careful not to take those assumptions as the true thing. We need to reflect, and we need to be very open about the possibilities as such. At the same time, like Erika indicates, you can't leave everything in the open and be uncertain about everything. So we need to be a bit careful there. I think maybe this alludes to as well airborne aerosolization and droplets and so on. And I've always taken these two options into account. I've never gone for one or the other. That is maybe not always obvious from the advices and so on, but you need to take really a broad picture and a broad scope, and I think that's the best way. And then keep on talking, looking at evidence and so on, to at least decrease that uncertainty to the way to the extent possible, because still today it is an unresolved matter actually.
Jurgen?
Yeah, maybe just to add on what Erika and Neil said. So in the risk assessment group, it's indeed, we always try to find a consensus in our different scientific advices. I think during COVID, much more difficult because evidence was lacking. But even now, when we make advices currently, we also have to deal with uncertainty sometimes, but we try to find a consensus. And what we're trying to do now is that also in our advice, if there would be a very different opinion, it is something we would add maybe in our advice somewhere, saying this is the consensus we reached, but this kind of aspects, there was no consensus. And I think it also helps, not on everything, of course, but some key points where there is no consensus, also to communicate this to the policymakers, because then you're transparent about the way you reached a consensus and the points for which there was no consensus. And I think it's also important about your procedural process of reaching or coming to a risk assessment or scientific advice, is that you clarify the process. How was it done actually? How many people were involved? What were their backgrounds? Was there any kind of different opinion? And to be transparent, and I think it really helps as well, because then policymakers know, voila, it is an advice, maybe not full consensus, but at least it was discussed.
All right. I don't see further questions in the chat or in the Q&A. Maybe I want to ask a question myself, if you allow me. During the pandemic, I noticed how certain communication outings could unintentionally maybe fuel stigma. For example, if you think about the early months of COVID-19, the virus was sometimes described as the Chinese virus, which could lead to prejudice, and which led to prejudice and racist against people of Asian descent in that period. And I think later on we saw like similar dynamics with unvaccinated people or specific communities that were portrayed as responsible for rising numbers, etc. So I was wondering if you have any ideas or advice on how we can communicate in a health crisis without falling into that kind of stigmatization language, while keeping messages clear and urgent, and if you would like advice to do certain things differently. Yes, Erika.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, but it's not so easy because, of course, nobody wants to induce stigma and to do harm to specific groups in society where the virus or the pathogen may be circulating more intensively for several reasons. On the other hand, you want to avoid also to fall back into some kind of very vague, aspecific non-informational communication, because we had, for instance, this discussion also very much during the first wave of Mpox in 2022, where it was felt maybe if we are going to say that this is mainly circulating among gay men, having several partners, then that will be very stigmatizing. On the other hand, it was also describing very well the at-risk group. So I believe personally a lot of it in how you convey the message, and you can also still speak matter-of-factly, objective, and respectful about a risk group, but it's a slippery slope. And yes, sometimes viruses started to circulate because of specific behaviors, because of wedding parties, or because of sexual festivals, or whatever.
Mhm.
So it's complicated, and from a public point of view, it is important also to describe the situation where infection takes place, but always respectful, and so to think twice how you're going to. But I think it's a very delicate balance.
Yeah.
I think indeed the ethical aspects of communication are often overlooked. So it's very important to keep those in mind as well. And in here, especially the work of Mika, I think can also give a lot of insight in how to do this. So again, I recommend to read her reports as well.
Yes. All right. Well, since I don't see any further questions, I think we can close this session. So first of all, I want to thank the entire panel, Ingrid, Mieke, Neil, Jorgen, and Erika, for this insightful discussion. And thank you for everyone for joining us today and listening and asking questions. So as I said at the beginning of this talk, this recording will be available very soon on our SciMingle YouTube channel. And our next lunch talk will be on November 19 with Jo de Tavernier, who will demonstrate how you can use ChatGPT to prepare for media interviews, including live prompts and examples and a Q&A. And then again, a quick reminder, next Tuesday, the 21st of October, is the Flemish PhD Cup final, and you can still vote for your favorite PhD via phdcup.be. And maybe you can even attend the live event in Ghent if you like to cheer on the finalists. And I saw, Ingrid, maybe you want to share what you just shared still as a final note?
Yeah, this hour just flies by, and if it has not been enough to discuss all the things that we have discussed about enough today, then I would also very much like to say that we are very happy to be in touch with the watchers and anybody else who would be interested. You can find more information about our symposium and workshops that we are organizing related to pandemic communication in November. Have a look at the QR code for that. It's an opportunity for those for you who were or are involved in communication as part of this process to share your challenges and best practices. We will be discussing those, so please come and join us if you would like to do that. Also, if you would like to be interviewed by me as part of this project, because you think you have a lot more to say, reach out to me. We're very happy to engage with that. The report of this study should be available in spring 2026, and scientific publications will also follow. And then that leaves me with thanking you, Daniela and SciMingo, for inviting me to do this lunch talk. And also thank you very much to Erika, Jorgen, Mieke, and Neil for sharing all your insights with us. And last but not least, thanks to all those that have been watching.
Yes. So thanks again, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and this talk, and see you at the next one. Have a good day.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.